I'm going to begin this conversation about branding by showing you this very brief video. So how many of you knew that was Apple from the moment it started? Why do you think you recognized it?
Look and feel, texture.
Yep. Music.
Keywords.
Font. Design. Yep. So Apple is one of those iconic brands that became iconic almost from the very beginning of its start. And it has been successful in doing so because it has such a incredibly clear brand, incredibly clear identity. Now, one of my goals is to make Unitarian Universalism as clear as Apple in the world. Did you notice the spiritual messages in that? People are really motivated by what I think is essentially spiritual content. There's a great book called The Culting of Brands that talks about how branding needs to recognize as much from religion as it does from marketing or business or anything like that, to pay attention to what makes people feel like they want to belong. So we began this process in thinking about branding a few years ago. We started to talk on Leadership Council level about how do we describe to people what the UUA does, who we are, what value do we bring to the world, which is always a really complicated subject, right? Because then immediately we get into, well, are we talking about all of Unitarian Universalism? Are we talking about Unitarian Universalist congregations? Are we talking only about what the staff does? Are we talking about the ends of the association? How are we really talking about that? And so this conversation goes around and around and around and around. How many of those conversations have you been in? How can we really talk about this? And finally we said, yes, we'll just have the conversation. We don't need to figure out who we're speaking on behalf of. We need to figure out how we can describe something about us and see where it goes from there. So we started working with a consultant to develop what is a brand framework. But one of the things that he quickly made us become aware of is that branding is not about a tagline. It's not about pretty colors. It's about being really clear about who you are. And so what we're talking about is finding a way to send a clearer signal into the world about who Unitarian Universalists are and what value we bring to the world. I would venture to say that we don't send a very clear signal right now. Would you agree? So, we're also talking about this right now because of the tremendous culture change, which Carrie articulated so beautifully for you, and I know Peter talked about during his presentation. You know, in a time when the world is shifting so dramatically, you have to figure out how you shift your language about yourself and how you talk about yourself. We can no longer make assumptions that people can understand who and what we are. And we're also doing this as a way of recognizing that we have, for a very long time, been really talking only to us, right? To people who already know Unitarian Universalism, as opposed to figuring out how do we express ourselves beyond our walls in our communities. And so for all of these reasons, we've started getting deeply into this branding conversation. And the point of it is to be able to articulate something that is different so that it stands out, people can identify it, something that is relevant, that actually speaks to people's lives where they are right now, and that's simple. It has to be simple. So branding is, in the way we have been approaching it, is about much more of the process of having these conversations about our identity, about who we are, what we do, and why it matters, than it is about the end product. We're really excited that we're actually going to get an end product in a few weeks, but it really hasn't been about that. If all we had done was speed through a process and have some consultants come in and say, here's your new tagline, here's your logo, it would have been worth almost nothing. And people have paid lots and lots of money for that almost nothing in the past, and we did not want to replicate that kind of process. So it answers these three essential questions. Who are we? What do we do? And why does it matter? So any effective brand has to answer those three questions. Now, you remember when we used to have to do the elevator speeches? Everybody had their elevator speech about what Unitarian Universalism is. I venture to say that it probably didn't accomplish all of these three things, right? It's an incredibly challenging thing to do, to describe a religious process as opposed to a product. So that's what we're grappling with. As I was saying, branding is not the tagline or the logo. There's a great online slideshow about branding where he says that it's an effective brand is the person's gut feeling about who we are. And here's the kicker. It's not what we say it is, it's what they say it is. So one of the consultants that we interviewed, we did not actually hire them, completely shifted my thinking around all of this by saying that what they tried to do in their process was to tell the hero's journey story. You remember the Joseph Campbell means where what you're trying to engage people with is how are they overcoming obstacles, how are they making changes in their lives, and why is it worth it to them? Because that really motivates people to a very high extent. But the hero's story is not the story of the UUA. It's the story of the people you're trying to reach. It's very different. Very different. So we're not trying to describe what the UUA does. We're trying to tell a story in which people can recognize themselves, in which people can see their own heroic journey, their own desires for change, their own transformation, in a way that they will feel like we will bring value to that journey. Does that make sense? So just that paradigm shift alone has been worth a huge amount of work and conversation. So the challenge in trying to communicate, obviously, and you've heard about this a lot already, is what communication vehicles do we use today? Look at how many there are. It's just astonishing. But how do you communicate something in today's world where there are a million different ways of doing communication? And how you communicate when there is so much noise in the world. And I'm not just talking about auditory noise. I'm talking about so much competing with our attention. So much that's asking for us to pay attention to it and not necessarily to us. And when there is such a proliferation of words. And we're really good at this, right? are really good at a proliferation of words, and a proliferation of words does not necessarily communicate. In fact, it almost always does not. So in this kind of context where, and one of the consultant we used talks about how in the last year, there are 10 times more books published than there was in the last 10 years. There is a flood of words, a flood of words. So how are we communicating something in the midst of noise, too many words, too many communication vehicles? So the next set of consultants that we engaged are the ones that are trying to develop what we call, I've learned that all this new language is so fun, our identity package. It's really cool. And so they did what they called a brand audit. And so they asked these really difficult questions about, well, how do people see you? How do people actually see you? What do they perceive about you? And they came up with some interesting answers. There were some assets, thank goodness. There were some cool things that they thought we brought, that we have a reputation for being progressive and inclusive. And I found this. I was at a conference in Stanford a few months ago, and it was a conference for nonprofit managers to work in social innovation. And every single one of them that I talked to said, well, I know Unitarian Universalists. You do great work in the world. You're almost always our best partners. So that kind of confirmed this for me, that especially among nonprofits and social service, et cetera, we have a reputation for being the people that show up and the people who show up for inclusivity. And that our beliefs, the way in which we structure our religious promise, is very resonant with what the culture is saying it wants right now. And we heard about all of that, obviously, from Carrie. And that we're an organization that's willing to make change and take risks. You know, that's one of the things that Peter insisted upon when he first became president, and he's been holding us to that we have to take risks and have to make changes. And it's actually a lot easier for a smaller organization to do that than a larger organization. You can move it a little bit more adeptly. And of course, there were challenges that they identified for us. And again, we heard about this from Carrie, that there are still very traditional trappings that people associate with us, that they still see church first and foremost, rather than the religious process that we're trying to describe. And if you look at, you know, the traditional order of service for most of our congregations, it's very Protestant, it's very tight, etc. We have a reputation for being kind of silly at times. You know, we're the butt of a lot of jokes. Garrison Keillor loves to take us on. But it's, despite the fact that we have on the one hand this kind of positive reputation, on the other hand, it's this, you know, UUs can believe whatever they want, all over the map kind of thing. I am completely convinced that Barack Obama would be a Unitarian Universalist if it wasn't considered silly, that he would not take some political hit for it. But everything I've heard him describe about his own spiritual life tells me he would be a Unitarian Universalist if it were more publicly acceptable. We have an aging and declining membership, not so much as others, but still so. We have a shrinking traditional funding base. We have a lack of clarity about what we're trying to say about ourselves. And we have a lack of consistency in our congregations and communities. And this was the biggest challenge with the last campaign. Do you remember the last media campaign that we did? You know, you could have some really exciting kinds of concepts that you could put in front of people, but if then they were going to go to a congregation that did not match the experience of what that was trying to say, you've lost them forever. They're never going to trust that image again. So one of the challenges that we've had in the past is feeling like, well, we have to work on getting all of our congregations as healthy and vibrant as possible. That is an ongoing work of ours. We do that all the time. We're going to continue to do that as much as possible. But now, with new technologies, we have an opportunity to do things, to be able to provide a promise that doesn't have to be kept by every congregation. Does that make sense? And we have an unclear ask and an unclear promise. So one of the things you have to be clear about is, what are you asking of people? If you're saying, well, come and join us, what do we want them to do? What is it we want them to do? So we've been having long, serious conversations about that here. And then what are we going to promise them? What is the experience that they're going to have? So we have some opportunities that they identified. Again, that our tenets are topical and resonant with the broader culture. And that there's a very high desire for an understanding of how to live a meaningful life. We're kind of finally coming out of that much more consumerist mentality in which people are really interested in seeking the spiritual values, which is why you see them resonant in the Apple ad. I watched 2 ads at a movie recently. One of them was this Apple ad, and another one was for Cadillac, of all people. And they were putting all of this spiritual imagery into their ads. They're doing a better job at selling religion than we are, because they know that people are desiring something more meaningful. And they're going to find a way to twist their product into doing that for people. We have this huge millennial audience that is untapped, that is interested in approaching the world very much the way that we want to approach the world. And as I said, we have these new technologies that are going to allow us to do things where a group could start to form with materials for small group ministry, for example, and meet in a coffee shop. We don't have to require them to go to a traditional congregation. We can kind of do church in a box and offer it to people in a way that they can immediately take us up on. And that I think will then motivate congregations to do a better job with what they're going to be offering people. We have some buried things that we have not made explicit to the wider community. One is this notion of individual choice and experience in religion, that it's not a mediated religious experience. You don't have to have something in between you and whatever your ultimate source of truth is. So we haven't really clearly articulated the difference in the essence that we bring into the world. One of the people that's working with us on this grew up as a what was some kind of traditional evangelical religion, and their way of phrasing this is, you can go to a church and they won't make you feel like crap. So it's like, okay, can I quote you on that? And it's like, yes. So a lot of people do associate their church experience with punishment. So the other lost opportunities that we're not communicating is how radical our message is and has been from the beginning. I think we've been a little afraid to really highlight and focus on that. Again, that there's no mediation between you and your spiritual experience, that we offer an ability for people to have an experience that doesn't require there to be something in between. And that what we're talking about is the opportunity to come together to build your own spiritual life and better values in the world together. We are the one kind of organization that brings that spiritual and that social justice promise together. And that people have to participate. So some more missed opportunities, that, the sense of openness becomes whatever, that we haven't really defined that clearly enough, that we're trying too hard to please all people, that our distinct point of view is lost in the swell of information. And oh, by the way, we have a very academic and cerebral tone. Surprising. And a lot of times we are afraid to ask people to participate and to push. I'm going to get to something for you to participate in. So their analysis of our current primary audience comes from obviously some surveys we've been doing, but also looking at the kinds of things that are on our website and what they suggest about our current. So this will be no surprise to you that we have this primary audience of highly educated, liberal, affluent, inner-directed, cerebral, nonconformist, older, mostly white, although we do have a growing Latino population, people with mixed religious backgrounds, very committed to LGBTQ rights, as well as relationships, activists, etc. So this sounds like us, right? That's a very, very small portion of the population. Very, very small portion of the population. Now, do you think the millennials that Carrie was describing earlier today are going to recognize themselves in this population? Some will. Right, right. They will see them as their parents or their grandparents, whom they actually like. The great thing about millennials is they like their parents and their grandparents, which is really nice. But they're not necessarily going to see themselves and the way they live their lives as reflected by this primary audience. And if all we try to do is speak to this primary audience, we're going to miss all of the others. So the prospective audiences that we have, again, are the millennials and the spiritual but not religious. So it's not just millennials that this spiritual but not religious is growing in. It's also all generations. All generations have an increasing number of people who do not want to identify with traditional religion. We have great prospective audience with young families, but here's the kicker. It's young families who actually want to participate in religious community together, not as separate groups. They want to have a multi-generational experience because they're separated most of the time from their families. Religious refugees, people, which has always been obviously one of our primary audiences. So a big part of what we're asking ourselves then is how do we signal to those audiences? What is it that it requires for us to say to those audiences that are going to get their attention? So we're trying to find ways to signal something simple, different, and, do you remember? Simple, different? That matters. That's relevant, right. So what we've come up with are some initial phrases that have helped us think about how we start to shift our culture and how we start to shift our behaviors and how we start to change our communications to work to signal more in these directions to these prospective audiences. And so we've come up with some phrases that seem to capture some of the active ways we want to begin to describe ourselves. So the promise that we want to be able to make to people is that they can join us on a faithful adventure. That it's not something that it's going to be handed to people, that it's something they can fully participate in, that they can engage and they can actually set the course for. We also want to communicate that we're promising that they can come with the entirety of their person and step out on that hero's journey ledge and do something different, and they will be held. They will be held when they come to us with that kind of courage. And that it is a lifetime of development. It's not just one thing that you learn once and then it's done. and that there is this sense of radical inclusion. We also want to communicate that we have the personality of activism that inspires, that is brazen in its acceptance. I love these kind of much more active, clear, shorter words, steeped in compassion. Now, you might be recognizing already that this is a little aspirational, right? Is this how you would describe most of our congregations? Necessarily. It would be nice. It would be nice. But a big part of the critique we've gotten as we've talked about this branding framework to people is they say, well, that's not what UU congregations are like. It's like, well, maybe it's time they were. Maybe it's time for this kind of process to activate all of us to aspire to move in different directions, to live up to our values. And the values we want to communicate are that we understand ourselves as part of a larger universe of which we are only one small part. That community fuels this activism, that we are resolute in our welcome. Again, you see aspirational in this. And so what it takes is first and foremost an internal examination. So the whole staff has been going through a process of asking ourselves, what is it that we are doing, and how does it signal whether we're living up to this framework? So guess what? We took a look at something like, our website. Does our website communicate these things? No. Not because it's a horrible website with really bad information, but because it understands its purpose as being to give people a lot of information rather than to signal something clear to these kind of potential audiences that we're talking about. So that's just one example of something that we're looking at and going, oh my gosh, that website only communicates to people who have already found us and who already belong in that first category that I talked about. So we have, and this is no criticism, Peter, but on the front page of the website is Peter's speech at General Assembly. Well, that's interesting to people who wanted to know what happened at General Assembly. What does that communicate to a millennial who's trying to figure out what Unitarian Universalism is? So just that kind of realignment and looking at the world from that perspective of what does this communicate to people who don't know about us, we're applying to every one of our practices internally. It's a big part of why the building is a huge part of our new signaling, the new building. But it also requires this outward orientation. An ability to step out of our own shoes and look at how people might see us, which is why it's absolutely critical that we have these outside consultants helping us with this. We would not be able to do this work ourselves because we would not be able to see ourselves in that sense. And it requires us doing some experiments, taking on some new projects and figuring out how we can move ahead in some different ways, and then developing some new social norms that really make our promise true. When you look at the congregations that have grown the most, they have been those that were fellowships, which is really surprising. Once we did that analysis, it was the leading indicator of a congregation not being able to grow is its age. The congregations that are the oldest are the least likely to grow. So our greatest potential does not mean that old congregations like the one Jim is serving that I belong to cannot resurrect itself and find new ways of being, but it takes a huge amount of intentionality rather than just assuming, well, we can just keep doing the same thing over and over again and that's always going to work. But it's actually newer congregations and the ones that allow for people to participate more fully that are growing, not just in Unitarian Universalism, but across the board religiously. So I find it actually hopeful and you know, and I recognize that some of our fellowships did not always bring some of the best practices to the fore, that were often seen as exclusive and too heady and that sort of thing. But for us to be able to reframe a new way of doing religious experience, of spiritual experience, of conversation about what's most meaningful, and be able to do that anywhere, to be able to give people the infrastructure to do that anywhere, I think is going to save us. I think it's going to save us. It's very institutionally hard to figure out. No. Well, what we're hoping is that this granting framework is going to be so inspirational to congregations that they will start to do their own practice of asking whether they can be in alignment with that, rather than saying, the UUA is telling you you have to do this, which God knows never works, never in a million years works. But if we do our job right with this, we're going to find something that is going to be really motivational for people to do their own process. And then a piece of what we're going to be teaching congregations is how to do their own examination like we have been trying to do at the UUA. So it's not just here, congregation, take this and put it in your local newspaper. It's here, congregation, what does this say about how you need to adapt and change in order to reach these folks? But without that, it's really hard to go to the congregation now and say that this is going to hopefully give us that, again, the signal that's going to get congregations' attention and ways in which they can then start living into that.
One of the things that you mentioned, but I want to emphasize, is that all of this stuff in the framework was created by a whole bunch of UUs that are very, very diverse. So what we're trying to do is hold up a mirror to people and say, this isn't coming like from a few folks at headquarters and their pals. This is what a broad segment from across the country, different age groups, have said is most central and essential about who we are. And it's really kind of holding our best aspirations up for our people. And that's, I think, part of a key thing in making culture change, is that it's not imposed. It's lifting up to people, reminding them of who they want to be.
The firm that we hired to do this next stage of the creative process is called Proverb. And they understand, and their URL is thetruthmadesimple.com. And, you know, obviously that appealed to us a lot. But what they talk about is that their process is one of sifting, where you take all of these concepts and all of these things we've come up with in the framework, and you sift them until the most important thing distills out. And that's what we're waiting for, to find that kind of clarity that's going to help us describe this in a, I think, new and different sort of way that doesn't involve some of the old tropes that we keep trying to use. So I'm looking for something that's going to describe the incredible potential we now have in a church like All Souls in Tulsa, which is doing Pentecostal worship, at the same time as we're describing these great new humanist groups that are rising up on college campuses and other places. What is it that we're going to be able to describe that encompasses that? And to me, it's the brave souls is a way of describing that, because both of those are experiences of bravery, are experiences of being willing to put yourself out there. So, so I think we're looking for that kind of fresh language that is going to be able to help us articulate this in a different kind of way. And some of these phrases, I think, get us closer to it, but we're still in the sifting process.
So where does our theology and our actual religion fit into this?
Well, that's a big question that we've been, the group of 50 people that Peter was talking about, were absolutely insistent that they see that reflected in this as well. So it can't just be an Apple ad, but it's got to be some kind of language that manages to bridge those worlds. So, you know, we're trying to gesture toward it with things like faithful adventurers and steeped in compassion and reverence found here. But we're real clear that whatever we come up with has to have that spiritual emphasis.